You're listening to the DFO Rundown podcast with Frank Saravalli and Jason Gregor on dailyfaceoff.com.
Welcome to episode 44 of the DFO Rundown at dailyfaceoff.com. I'm Jason Gregor alongside Frank Saravalli, who's playing hurt today. I'm not sure if it's Kucherov or other type of injuries, but we'll get to that in a second. And as once again, we're coming to you live from the woodjerseys.com studio. I have my Boston Bruins jerseys. Frank has his Toronto Maple Leafs one. And of course, this is an officially licensed NHL product. You can get it at woodjerseys.com. You want to take your fan cave, your office room to a new level, you can do it at woodjerseys.com. Getting new teams all the time. And Frank, how you doing? How are you feeling here? Is this like a punctured lung? What's happening?
I wish it was a punctured lung. This has been a very nasty stomach virus. I don't know where I picked it up at, but envision like Dumb and Dumber style sequences where you're just, it hasn't been pleasant.
No, you don't. So basically not a good first date is what you're saying.
No, and you know what's hilarious? It's funny you said that because I got home from Tampa on Thursday and my wife was like, hey, your mom offered to watch the kids. Like, do you want to go out for dinner? I'm like, oh, I don't know. Like, I'm like not really feeling so great. And we ended up going anyway. And like half of it, I was in the bathroom. So like literally first date. Yeah.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, it was unbelievable.
Oh yeah, knock on wood. It's been a long time since
you know what? And the funny thing is, the running joke with me and my buddies all the time is like what I would do for a 3-week stomach virus to lose like 30 pounds. and now I'm actually like, yeah, this is it.
Yeah, and you're like, no, I'd rather just.
Yeah, I was kidding. I'd rather just get on Peloton.
No, work out or change a diet. That's not going to be as painful. Going to be as painful short term anyway. There's lots going on. Mike Russo is going to join us today. Here we are. The buyout window officially opens up. And of course you had it at dailyfaceoff.com. Like the obvious one, of course, is Tony DeAngelo. You've been on that story for, ever since it happened many months ago. And that's an easy buyout for the Rangers, just because he's only at 1/3. Then there's guys like James Neal, but I get a sense some of these teams, Frank, might be waiting until after the expansion draft to pull the trigger. What do you think?
They could. That's an obvious, way to move forward. But in this case, with the protection lists that are due, if you have questions, and the Minnesota Wild are a perfect example with a Zach Parise moving forward, and we can ask Russo about that, you'd want to do it before then to free up a protection spot so that you don't have to protect a guy like Zach Parise who has the no move clause that forces you to protect him. So that was one of the things that, was a theme going back to 2017 when 3 players were bought out that had no move clauses in their deals that forced them to be protected. And so those happened pretty quickly once the buyout window opened so that teams could free up those protection spots. So it's a 2-part thing. You get the cap savings, but you also get the expansion protection list savings as well.
Yeah, like guys like Zach Parise make sense. James Neal in Edmonton, I'd be surprised if they buy him out before the expansion draft. I could see it afterwards for sure.
But wouldn't buying? I guess James Neal, you weren't protecting either way.
You're not protecting. Yeah, there's no benefit, right? And so why not leave him exposed on the off chance? Seattle's like, because the one thing, James Neal still scored 19 goals in 55 games in 2020, and then he got COVID. And then he got really sick again during the season. When you look at the lack of actual goal scorers available in the expansion draft, like I highly, highly doubt it. But if you're Edmonton, you're like, well, you never know. Maybe Seattle's like, well, let's take this guy.
There's no chance though.
Expansion draft, but there's no benefit for Edmonton to buy him out because they don't have to protect him.
Well, other than freeing up the cap space if you want to make another move.
No, but I meant before the expansion draft, right?
If you're going to do it I don't know if it really, I'd be shocked if the Seattle Kraken took James Neal.
Oh, yeah.
He just, even if he scores goals, wouldn't you just wait until he's bought out and then sign him for pennies on the dollar?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, no, like they're not going to draft them. I think Ken Holland, the reason I believe the Oilers wouldn't buy him out beforehand would go to, you're going to exhaust every possible option you can, because you're not protecting him. And then if on the off chance on the 22nd, you want to buy him out, then you buy him out.
Right, but wouldn't you do it sooner rather than later to get the cap space savings so that you can make other transactions if you need to, if you want to trade for Duncan Keith, so to speak?
Well, but the Oilers aren't up. The Oilers have boatload of cap space in the offseason, right? Like whether you sign whether you trade or not for Duncan Keith would be irrelevant to the cap right now for Edmonton, right? They're not. You could add Keith with James Neal on the roster and still be 15 mil under.
Yeah. Well, and look, to touch on the Duncan Keith situation for a second with the Oilers, my understanding is that there is definite interest there, but I think that interest and paying a certain price has waned in the last week or so. That the Oilers have had discussions with the Chicago Blackhawks. First off, there's two things in play. One, Chicago is not willing to retain any salary. And the second thing is whatever pieces the Oilers had on the table to try and make something like that happen, and I believe it's centered around Caleb Jones plus something else. And you can understand why Jones was part of the picture, because Chicago wants to also try and bring in Seth Jones, his brother, and having both of them there might entice the situation to get him to try and sign long-term in Chicago. But whatever Edmonton had on the table, my understanding is one or more of those pieces has since been removed, and Edmonton has basically offered a more or less take it or leave it type deal. That there's only a certain price that they're willing to pay, given that Chicago is not willing to retain money. And I understand it at this point. We talked about this previously on the pod, the idea of, having Duncan Keith play a very specific role at this point in his career. He can't be playing 26 minutes a night for you.
Yeah. So I broke it down a week ago on the Duncan Keith situation from what I heard and things that didn't make sense to me. I believe that Chicago's in a tough spot because they believe they're trading Duncan Keith, who's a 3-time Cup winner and a 2-time Norris Trophy winner, and he's not that player now. Not retaining salary, I don't think is going to happen in any sort of trade. But the second rounder and Caleb Jones, Edmonton doesn't have a second rounder this year, and they do have one next year. Okay. But even if they would have offered that, I don't see how Chicago wouldn't have said no. But here's the thing. So let's say you would have traded Caleb Jones in the second for Duncan Keith. Well, then Seattle can just claim Caleb Jones in the expansion draft because Chicago would protect 3 defensemen not named him. So I never really bought into the rumblings of what was on the trademark because it didn't really make any sense. Like, so Chicago, I guess they're like, well, we just get a second rounder for Duncan Keith. That's probably at 5.5 mil. That's a good trade. But I don't see Edmonton acquiring Duncan Keith at the full price. I said it a week ago in the conversations I had with people. That was not going to happen. I think a trade for Duncan Keith will happen when Chicago recognizes that they're not trading, and they're in a tough spot. I get it. Duncan Keith's played the second most games in franchise history in Chicago. He's won 3 Stanley Cups, and he wasn't just like, a guy on a cup winning team. He was playing 31, 28, and 27 minutes a night in their 3 cup runs. Like, he was a legit player. And I know his WAR numbers for analytics people aren't great the last few years. Totally valid. But you also have to consider he played most of his ice time with a raw rookie in each of those 2 seasons. Mm-hmm. And he's had 0 continuity with any defense partner. Like last year, the most minutes he played with anyone was a rookie, Ian Mitchell. And that was only 27% of his time. Like I think Duncan Keith can help a team in the right spot. He's not a top pair defenseman anymore, but he's just not worth 5.5. And I think ultimately if Chicago is going to want to deal him and if he says he wants out, Frank, every team knows that eventually they're going to trade him because you don't want guys back in your room who don't want to be there.
Well, I think the reason why Chicago doesn't have any interest in retaining money is because his real cash is so much lower than his cap hit that you're basically getting Duncan Keith for nothing. He's only owed a total of $3.6 million over the next 2 seasons. So that's 1.8 a year averaged out in real dollars when his cap hit is 5.53. So, moving forward, the Blackhawks are like, look, we know what the cap hit says, but what the real cash says, we're not going to dig into our pocket to pay that too when it's already so much lower than the cap hit. Yeah, so that's really the hang up. And I truly believe from talking to people around the league that the Blackhawks are going to hold firm on not being willing to retain because as they see it, 5.5 isn't outrageous for what they believe he still brings to the table.
No, and that's fair. But the truth is, and you're right, it's 2.1 million in cap space this year, and then 2.1 in actual dollars this year and 1.5 the following year. So the money itself, but if you're a competitive
But that's
team,
perfect for a team like Seattle.
Yeah, sure.
You've got abundant cap space and it costs less than what it says on paper. Like I think Seattle is a team that makes a lot of sense for Duncan Keith. Add in the leadership element and the resume and the name value in your marketplace. And then on top of that, put a guy that wants to be out in that area, Pacific Northwest. So the 4 teams I believe that, he'd be looking to go to are Seattle, Vancouver, Calgary, and Edmonton. And, I just think it works out. The question is, what is Seattle going to give up to get him, if anything? And that's the one thing that the Hawks, I think, weren't okay with, was the idea of letting him walk in the expansion draft if he decides to waive his no move clause and go for nothing.
Well, I think that's what's lowering his value overall. And while Chicago can say the money is so low, it's a great deal. If you're a team like Edmonton or even Calgary, who thinks they can compete for a playoff spot, $5.5 million cap space is what matters more than the actual dollars. And
Sure.
So that's what makes it challenging of a deal for sure. Now, Tony DeAngelo is going to get bought out by the Rangers. You've been all over that story, Frank. Who do you see as suitors for DeAngelo?
It's interesting, the teams that had checked in on DeAngelo going back to last season around the deadline, and I don't think anyone publicly wanted their team name connected to him because of the way that he left New York and how toxic the situation was in terms of, basically how he's viewed in the marketplace. And in fact, I'm really interested to see, I have no doubt that Tony DeAngelo is going to get signed this summer. My question is, when? Does it happen when free agency opens? Are there enough teams knocking on the door that they can be pitted against each other and he's able to sign a contract quickly? Or does a team try and slow play this well into August when everyone kind of dozes off and is at the cottage or is at the beach, and they try and pull the trigger then? So I think, having known a few of the teams and seen a few of them that were reported, I think Montreal, Winnipeg, I wonder about a team like the Florida Panthers. There were a number of teams that had expressed interest then in trying to make a transaction work, including having him play the season in the AHL to see if he was a fit for their organization. Would he make sense for a team like the Oilers?
Well, Edmonton's got to improve their defense. There's no question about it.
But you need the power play quarterback guy. I know Bouchard is expected to be the guy that steps up to replace Tyson Barrie, but he doesn't have the 50-plus point season on his resume that Tony DeAngelo does.
No, that's true. But
and potentially for pennies.
Yeah,
like he's not going to be signing for a lot of money.
That was my next question. Like, are we talking 1.5 to 2 million? Is that what you think?
It's hard to pin down because I don't know what the interest is going to be like exactly, but I would guess it's going to be for significantly less than he was making.
Yeah, no question. Like, I think Edmonton needs defenders. Well, Edmonton obviously would like to sign Adam Larson first. That's going to be a big thing for them before Seattle gets the opportunity on the 18th to talk to him. The other one, Frank, to me that I'm intrigued by now that it's over in Tampa Bay, congratulations, winning the Stanley Cup. I just want to say Nikita Kucherov's press conference after the game. I know some Montreal fans are upset with what he said. First of all, he was clearly a few beers deep at that point. I don't know any human being who a few beers deep might, not every time, but might sometimes say the wrong thing, whatever. But you know what? I had no problem with what Nikita Kucherov says. He's not there to appeal to Montreal fans at all, right?
It was an unnecessary shot, though. Like, it can't, I mean, I have no issue with it, but like, why go there? You just won the Stanley Cup.
Well, because, like I said, Frank, many beers deep is everybody has, and everybody, if you attest themselves, can admit that, probably say something you regret in hindsight, a little bit cocky or a little bit more relaxed. And really, like, if the worst thing Nikita Kucherov says in his NHL career is, geez, Montreal, give me a break. They celebrate like they won the cup. Their cup, like the last line was actually a really good chirp because it hits right to the heart of it. And Montreal fans might not like it. Any opposing fan base wouldn't like it.
Their final was the last round.
When I see media people complaining, I literally want to just be like,
it makes no sense because that's
back.
exactly what we want.
And it's like nothing he said was harmful.
Their mind, and then all of a sudden we're criticizing him, and then we wonder why they don't do it. I mean, I loved it. I was sitting there. Unfortunately, it's all on Zoom, so I was sitting there in a Tampa hotel lobby, like I was with a bunch of other reporters, and we were actually like cheering as it was happening. We were like, "This is must watch." My favorite line, actually, I need to add it to my arsenal, was when he kept saying, "That's some number one bullshit for me." So that's going to be something that I use regularly moving forward now because Nikita Kucherov said it. But it was awesome. Shirtless, honest, raw. And, it was an NBA style press conference. Our heads would explode in the hockey world if that's more of what we saw on a regular basis.
And let's be honest. At the end of the day, it's extremely harmless to say, hey, they celebrated like they won the cup. Their cup was last round. Honestly. That's not offensive to anyone. So let's maybe get some thicker skin for those who can't handle it. Like, give me a break. If that's going to offend you, you might want to step off and maybe log off of social media for an hour
or just crack open a beer.
Yeah, that's true. Now, Tampa's a team. I look at their protection list, Frank, and I crunch their numbers. I think there's a good chance they might expose Ryan McDonagh because he's got a no trade.
Came around on that, huh?
And they've got young foot and doesn't mean that Seattle takes him, but they've got you look at the trades they're going to make. And like Ryan McDonagh has 5 years left. He's a really good defenseman, but at 6.75, what are they going to get in return? I'm not sure they're going to have to Patrick Marleau any of their players here necessarily and give away a first rounder for a team to take him. But every team knows they're up against it. I'm sure every team's a little bit annoyed at what they did last year to manipulate the salary cap legally. I should say they did nothing wrong. And I think it's kind of due to a shortened season more than anything else. But I won't be stunned if Ryan McDonagh's name is on the list. I'm not saying they do it, but I won't be stunned if it is.
I feel like it took you a while to get to that point. That's exactly the point I was making last episode or 2 episodes ago when we had Ryan Clark on. Like, it was exactly that. Ryan McDonagh, fantastic player, but 5 years left at 6.75, and years like 3, 4, and 5 of that deal are probably going to be pretty painful. You probably need to get out in front of it if you can and entice someone else to take him. And again, I don't know if they need to do any enticing based on the way he played in the playoffs. He was Tampa's best defenseman in the playoff run, with all due respect to Victor Hedman.
Oh, McDonagh was excellent. And, I look at up front, the trades that they're going to have to make for some of their forwards. And the other thing is, though, Blake Coleman, do you think there's a chance they find a way to keep him? Like, that Gord, Coleman, Goudreau line was excellent for them. And I'm not sure how, obviously they'll get a raise a little bit. And Blake Coleman's a guy who probably can be a top 6 on a lot of their other teams. He was a 20-goal scorer multiple times in New Jersey. I'm just kind of curious, how the enticement of a three-peat, which we haven't seen since the New York Islanders, if that entices any of those players to want to come back and, maybe they squeeze out one or two,
a little bit less.
2 of the other guys. Yeah. I'm just curious about it now, watching, all their press conferences and the big, the motivation was back to back. I get it. And having it in front of your fans, but we haven't seen a three-peat, Frank, since the Islanders.
And with all due respect to, the idea of a three-peat, and I was actually having this conversation quickly with a Lightning player over the last couple of days. At a certain point, when you're Blake Coleman, you're hitting free agency at the age of 29. You got to collect the money. I mean, not to say he hasn't been earning a nice living, but at 1.8 for the last couple of years, this is his one chance to cash in. And so you've got your name on the mug twice. I think this is when you go to market and get paid. But I mean, money isn't everyone's motivation, but I would imagine in this case that you'd have to think long and hard about taking it somewhere else. And he's going to be more than doubling his money.
I'm curious which guy, we know that Tyler Johnson's obviously going to be moved somehow, some way. That's the obvious one. And you even mentioned it, maybe a potential buyout for him. But even after him, Frank, there's probably 2 other big contracts that have to be moved. And I'm just fascinated by which ones. I think what you do is you set up your expansion list exactly kind of the way we talked about. Go 8 skaters, 1 goalie. And your 4 forwards are Cirelli, Point, Stamkos, and Kucherov. Your 4 defensemen are Hedman, Sergachev, Chernak, and Foote. And then you make Seattle take a choice between one of those forwards that's high-priced or McDonagh.
either Palat, Gord, Johnson, or McDonough on D, and you're almost guaranteed at that point, unless they take a young guy off your roster, to lose one of those high-priced players, and you don't have to do any. It's almost like a blessing that Seattle is in the mix at entering the league at this point if they can take one off your hands.
I just don't see how they could turn down Yanni Gourde. I really like him as a player, but man, you wonder if Seattle just wants to put the screws to Tampa Bay just to force them to have to give away more assets to get rid of those contracts.
Well, that's why I was saying that's why you protect Cal Foote, because if not, they're saying, look, we're taking Foote all day long.
Yeah.
Look, if they want to take someone else and leave you with your good players, if they want to take Mitchell Stevens or if they want to take Matthew Joseph, that's fine. That just means you're going for the three-peat and you're going to try and find a way to shed a salary elsewhere.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to watch here the next few days, the protection lists. We'll get to Mike Russo because, the huge contract extension for 8 years for Eriksson Ek. Zach Parise, of course, a high potential buyout candidate. And Bill Guerin, who I feel is going to inherit Jim Rutherford's title as GM willing to make the most trades. I believe that Minnesota is going to be a team to watch for a variety of reasons this offseason. So we're going to have Mike on, who's of course tapped in better than anyone when it comes to the Wild and what they're going to do. So we'll get to that, but let's bring in producer Ty for buy or sell.
All right, buy or sell, as always, guys, is brought to you by Jock Market, the hybrid between fantasy sports and the stock market. That promo code DFO50 gets you a $50 deposit bonus, jockmkt.com or on your app store. I'm going to get things going with the Conn Smythe winner, Andrei Vasilevsky, 26 years old, 2 rings, a Conn Smythe. He's been nominated for the Vezina 4 times now. I'm going to say that by the time his career's done, and it could be potentially, 10 to 13 years still, he'll be regarded as a top 5 goaltender of all time. Jason, you buying or selling?
Yeah, I'm probably buying, man. Vasilevsky's unreal. Now, I know I tweeted out the picture and I get that the camera angle added it, but he looked gargantuan in that picture. So he is a very big goaltender. But the thing about Vasilevsky is it's so impressive is just how quick he is side to side. And that's where the game's going now. That's where the game's going. I don't see many weaknesses in his game. The only reason he wouldn't be there, I believe, is if he suddenly run into injury problems. I think right now he's the best goalie in the NHL. And I really don't, I'm not going to say it's not close, but I think he's the clear number 1.
Yeah, I'm buying as well. I agree with you. I think he's pretty universally regarded as the best goaltender in the world. And by the way, speaking of the shot of Vasilevsky with the chest protector, I saw an awesome meme going around the other day that said, now we know where they were hiding the extra $18 million.
Number 2, going to the other side of that Stanley Cup final matchup, the Montreal Canadiens. I'm looking at the playoff picture next year. I'm looking at their roster. I'm going to say the Habs miss the playoffs next year. Frank, you buying or selling?
I was actually thinking about that, how ridiculous that division is going to be.
Good.
And I have to go back and look and see exactly who is in that division because I'm all thrown off.
Florida, Tampa, Boston, Toronto would be ahead of them, right?
Yep. Yeah, I'm going to say I'm going to buy that that the Montreal Canadiens missed the playoffs next season.
The NHL Cinderella stories have not had good seasons after in a lot of cases. So it makes a lot of sense. And a lot of those teams weren't even in a division as good as Montreal. So yeah, I think it's very plausible, especially if they lose Jake Allen, suddenly they got to play Price more.
It's interesting. I saw a good stat too. This year was the 18th consecutive year that a different team lost in the final. So there's been no come back and lose again teams. And by the way, it's not unprecedented. That Dallas team this year, they were the finalists last year.
Yeah. Oh,
yeah.
Lots.
Let's go to number 3, back to the Lightning quickly. I'm going to say the roster dismantling that might need to happen will happen quickly, and that by the NHL draft, at least 3 big contracts will be moved off that team. That includes the expansion draft, but I'll say 3 big contracts by the draft moved out of Tampa. Jason, buying or selling?
So the end of the draft you're talking.
Yeah.
So they'll make trades on. Jeez, that's a good. Yeah, I'm going to buy that. They're definitely losing one in the expansion draft for sure. And I think Breeze, well, everybody knows the situation in Tampa. It's not a surprise. You can't hide it. So, yeah, I think they will do it. I'm not saying that they're going to get a lot of great returns, but for sure, I would agree. I think 3 guys will be gone.
I'm going to sell, and not to be a big conspiracy theorist guy, I'm really wondering about Victor Hedman and his injury. I haven't gotten any clarity on that. It's pretty clear that Victor Hedman was dealing with a pretty significant, everyone believes it was a knee injury.
So are you saying Kucherov 2.0? Is this what you're hinting at?
All I'm saying is look at Gary Bettman and Bill Daly's response in the press conference when I asked them before the series about it. There's not going to be a change in how this is handled.
Oh, yeah. Well, the players don't want it.
Doing the same exact thing again.
Yeah, the players are the ones who don't want the trade. You know why? Because there was $9.5 extra million to go around for other players this year because Kucherov's on LTIR. So the players will never vote against it. The challenge is if Hedman has surgery before the season begins, that's a lot longer to stay out compared to Kucherov.
Right, because it's an 82-game season.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I do think that could, we don't know what he's dealing with. So that's why I'm saying sell until I understand what this injury is and if there is surgery needed.
We've spent a lot of time talking about buyouts so far this episode. Frank, you got your list up on dailyfaceoff.com. I'm going to say at least 5 buyouts around the NHL. Frank, buying or selling?
Buying. I really think it's going to be in that 8 to 12 range.
Wow.
I do think there's a lot of teams that are considering it, whether they pull the trigger or not. I mean, you could see 2 from the Oilers alone, as you guys have mentioned. I still think with Koskinen, you ride it out just to get the cap hit off and get through this last year. But, something to consider for sure.
I'd actually probably buy out Koskinen ahead of Neal, but I'm biased because I think Neal can at least score you 15 or 18 goals, and Koskinen is what he is. But they won't buy out both. I would crush them for dead cap space when they think they're going to be really competitive. But I'm buying as well. I'm going to guess that there will be 7.
Last one for you guys. Colorado Avalanche. They got some big contracts that need to be handed out in 2 pretty big UFAs in Philip Grubauer and Gabriel Landeskog. I'm going to say one of those 2 doesn't end up back in Colorado next season. Jason, you buying or selling?
Nah, I'm selling. Landeskog, I don't see the captain leaving. I think he feels that team is really close and they're right on the brink of it. He wants to be there. And Grubauer's a good goalie. Obviously he's going to get a raise because he got as a Vezina finalist, but he could go somewhere else, and I don't know if he's going to have the same success. They've got a really good foundation in Colorado. They got lots more good players coming. So I think both stay.
Yeah, I'm going to sell as well. Look, you've got some LTIR possibilities with a guy like Eric Johnson that could bring you additional cap space. You could also buy him out. And they've got $25 million in cap space at this point in projected space. So, you're dealing with Makar, you're dealing with Landeskog, Grubauer. I don't think Grubauer is going to be a super high-end ticket. They'll find a way to make it work.
There you go. That is Buy or Sell, brought to you by Jock Market. Promo code DFO50 gets you a $50 deposit bonus.
All right, Frank, let's get right to it. We got Mike Russo coming in, the Minnesota Wild. Lots of interesting angles to look at.
Our next guest is one of the longest serving beat reporters in the National Hockey League. He first started out covering the Florida Panthers way back in the 90s for the Sun Sentinel. He has since been covering the Minnesota Wild for more than 2 decades. Michael Russo, welcome to the DFO Rundown.
How are you? What's up, Frank?
Yeah, glad to have you on board. Really busy time for a lot of teams, but particularly the Minnesota Wild. It seems like Bill Guerin at this point is juggling a lot of different balls as the Wild gets set, not just with the buyout window opening. Everyone's curious, do the Wild, potentially try and buy out Zach Parise from that mammoth contract that still remains for a guy that was a healthy scratch? You've got the expansion draft coming up, and Parise actually ties into that a little bit as well. Mike, what's going on? What have you been covering? What have you been after at this point with the Minnesota Wild?
Well, I think all of that, Frank. I mean, right now, I think Billy Guerin's got a lot of balls in the air, and it's really hard to get a full grasp of exactly what's going on with the offseason. And I think he's trying to figure out exactly the amount of cap space that he needs to re-sign both Kirill Kaprizov and Kevin Fiala. And as you mentioned, they've got some expansion issues that they've got to deal with as well. And, you know, as you also mentioned, the buyout window opens today and they've got to decide on Zach Parise. You know, really what it comes down to is that 1 year this year where you get about a $5 million cap, extra cap space for next year, and they might need it. And you're going to get 6.5 the following year, 7.5, 7.5, and then 8.33 the next 4 years after that. But that $5 million could be so valuable this upcoming year that they might have to do it. And I don't think that he would make that decision until he sees who he's going to lose in expansion. But we'll see in the next couple, pretty much 10 days, what's going to happen with this offseason.
Well, so much of it centers around Kirill Kaprizov, as you mentioned, and obviously Fiala's ticket is going to be pretty big as well. But Kaprizov, you know, it's been interesting. I saw your report. I also saw the tweet from Kevin Weeks a couple weeks ago. And in digging in and doing my own reporting on the situation, it seems like whatever talk has been out there about the potential of Kaprizov actually going back to Russia is probably a little bit more than just a mere threat, given, you know, the total dollars that may be offered to him on a really short-term deal if they can't come together on something with an extension for the Wild. The sense I get is that the Kaprizov camp has more interest in being on the short-term end. The Wild would obviously rather be on the long-term end. How does this get sorted out?
Yeah, I mean, I think both sides are going to have to compromise. Like, I just don't see Bill Guerin blinking, at least the last time that we've discussed this with him, on a short-term deal. And the reason why is because it took him 5 years to get here. He could become an unrestricted free agent in 2024 in just 3 seasons. And his agent is also Panarin's agent. And Panarin originally signed a bridge deal under his previous agent. And that bridge deal ended, and he wound up becoming an unrestricted free agent. He signed a big ticket in New York. And I think that's what the Wild are trying to advance or avoid. And the issue is, if you sign him for 3 or less, you can walk him straight to free agency. So I think that both sides are going to have to understand that, like, from Billy Guerin's standpoint, that Kaprizov doesn't want to sign a 7 or 8 year deal for 2 reasons. One, the cap is going to continue to escalate, and potentially, if he continues on this trajectory, he could become a 10 or 11 or a $12 million player in the next 3 or 4 years, potentially. But I think that Kaprizov also needs to understand that the Wild have waited a long time for him, and they don't want to sit there and put him in a position where he could walk straight to free agency. So I think that they're going to have to settle in a 4 or 5 year deal, and we'll see if they can get it done. I know they were going to talk this week. It was more of a touch base meeting. I don't believe that it was something that they figured that they were going to be able to iron out this contract. But the big thing here is, I think originally in this whole, complicated offseason that the Wild had, that they figured that it would be just the easiest thing to get Kaprizov done, and then they can move on to Fiala and Eriksson Ek. And when they ran into complications with Kaprizov, that's when he suddenly turned to Eriksson Ek. And I think Billy was kind of surprised at this for the amount of money. I mean, they're trying to make Kaprizov the highest paid player in franchise history on a long-term deal. And I think he was almost blown away that it was not as simple, just sign on the contract and take the money. So it's definitely thrown a little wrinkle into this offseason, and now suddenly has them counting up dollars and cents, and really, I think having a situation where they just almost don't know exactly where to go next. And so they've got a lot of things that they're trying to tackle right now, guys.
So, Mike, are you suggesting that they were willing to give Kaprizov 8 years at like 10 mil, because Parise and Suter are 9.5, so they would have paid him that much on a salary average?
Yeah, well, Parise and Suter are 7.5. So they were 98 divided by 13.
Oh, right,
so
right,
so say 7.5. So they were offering. My gut says they were offering around $9 million on an 8 year deal, probably 8.5, 8 on a 7 year deal. And right now that hasn't been that it's not only hasn't been accepted, it's pretty much been rejected from Kaprizov's camp. And so this is like one of the first negotiations I've ever covered where the team is throwing the world at a player that's played 55 games, and he's just like, no, I want a lot less money and a lot less term. And that's the situation that Billy's found himself in. And it's complicated the Fiala matter, because Fiala also wants some significant money in term this offseason. And it's thrown his situation into exactly figuring out what they want to do with expansion and everything. So it's really created a bit of an issue here.
So then, if we look at that 4 or 5 year deal, are we talking Matt Barzal numbers then on a shorter term deal, like 7 mil?
That's what I think. That I think Billy would be willing to go there. on a bridge deal, I'd be shocked if he went higher than 6.5, 7 at all. And so that's why, I mean, this is. I don't know where this is going to go. I'd be shocked if this kid came here and wound up just saying, you know what, I'm going to go back to the KHL. But I think that's the threat. That's his only leverage, because he's the type of restricted free agent that he can't sign an offer sheet. He can't sign with any other team. Can't go to arbitration. So really, his only leverage is to threaten to go back to Moscow. And obviously, Moscow would take him back with open arms and give him a bunch of money to play there. But I just think this is all going to be an empty threat at the end of the day. He wants to play in the NHL. He showed last year how good of a player he could be, that he could be a star in this team. And I think the Wild want to show him that he could be the guy that leads this team into the future. But it needs to be, I think both sides need to understand that if you've really played 55 games in the NHL, to expect that they're going to throw 11, 12 million at you on an 8 or 7 year deal at this point in his career, I just don't see that happening. So that's why I just think both sides are going to have to compromise, and Billy's going to have to understand their position, that they want to go on a shorter term deal, but they've got to come up and throw the Wild a bone here and at least take Kaprizov past his UFA year in 2024 to avoid the constant distraction of us constantly writing and asking the question, is he just going to be gone in a couple of years here?
Well, Minnesota's never had that. They had a young Marian Gaborik, but they haven't had that electrifying player. And I'll tell you, honestly, I never gravitated to watch the Wild more than I had this year because of Kirill. He was an electrifying player, and Kevin Fiala is a really good player as well. So let's get to him on what numbers are you hearing? What numbers are you thinking for Fiala on a term and a salary?
Well, I think Kaprizov's sitting back in Europe right now, looking at this almost with popcorn, saying, all right, they just gave 8 years and 5.25 to Eriksson Ek, and I've got a pretty good sense of what they're offering Kaprizov. Well, I'm the guy that's been here longer. I'm the guy that's had 2 good years in a row. I'm the guy that lived up to my bargain on the bridge deal that he just signed, the 2 year, $6 million deal at 3 per. So I think he's sitting there and wanting big time money. I think he wants term and money. I don't know if the Wild want to go long term with him. I would really doubt it. I think they've always wanted to go 4 or 5 years max with him. But I think he wants serious money. I think he's looking at more than 7, maybe even 8. And that's what, he has hired Craig Oster from Newport and let go Claude Lemieux after the bridge deal. So that's also to me a sign of somebody they expect to be paid handsomely. And I think he wants to be the man here. And so we'll see where that goes. The problem is that cap hit is definitely, we're going to have to see who they lose in expansion and then start to count the dollars. Right now, they only have about 15.9 million, and that's to fill out the entire roster. They only have 15 guys signed. So there's going to have to be something to give. And I really do genuinely believe that Billy has at least dangled Fiala's name out there to see if he's the type of player that can maybe earn this team a number 1 or 2 center. We'll see where that goes. But my gut says that Fiala is looking to hit a home run contract here. And I don't know if Billy Guerin can stomach that. And again, the cap situation is what it is. And so they're going to have to figure out how that sorts itself out here. And I think a lot of it's going to have to do with, who they lose in expansion. Do they lose Dumba? Do they lose a Susi? And that all then could determine if they wind up having to buy out Zach Parise, or even maybe get Zach to waive his no move to be traded for another team to buy him out. I think that's probably unlikely. But that's another potential avenue that the Wild could take, is to try to see if there's a team that needs to get to the cap floor or has a bunch of cap space that's willing to take on that dead money. The problem is it's a huge burden for any team, even Seattle, to take that type of buyout.
Right. It's not so much the first year, it's the next 3.
Yeah. And we just saw with Vegas. I mean, Vegas in years 3, 4 of their organization just ran into serious cap issues. And Seattle's a team that wants to be competitive and wants to, by all reporting, wants to spend to the cap legitimately, not with just a bunch of dead money. And, we'll see what type of assets maybe Billy can offer up Ron Francis to do something like that. But that, really it's 2.5 this year, and then it goes to 6.5, 7.5, 7.5, and then 8.33 for the next 4 years after that. And I just don't know if that's something that really any team would want to take on, just in case all of a sudden Seattle has the same type of success that a Vegas has and suddenly needs that cap space to spend on their own guys. Can you imagine if Seattle has to get rid of guys in years 3 and 4, and it's because they have a dead cap hit of 7.5 for Zach Parise? So I think that was sort of a, wild fantasy by wild fans and probably media that were throwing out there, a couple of weeks ago. But, I still think that's probably an unlikely scenario here. So it's something's going to have to give this offseason. There's no doubt about it. And it's really hard to fully grasp exactly what's going on.
Well, you're right, Mike, because you start to do the back of the napkin math at just some of the numbers that you were throwing out. Yeah. If Kaprizov's around 7 on a medium term deal, and if Fiala's, the number I kept hearing for Fiala was around 8, as you mentioned, all of a sudden that's 15. You're going, okay, how do they make this work moving forward? Yeah. One of the avenues as a short-term fix, like we just talked about, would be that Parise buyout, but only for the first year. It really benefits you. You're only kind of kicking the can down the road a year is what you're doing. So then that leads us to the expansion draft. And one way to unload a salary would that be that way. And everyone continues to focus and has Matt Dumba's name circled, as you mentioned. I just have a hard time believing that the Wild are going to be willing to let Matt Dumba go in the expansion draft. I think he would be the target from Seattle. It makes sense to me that way. But I think they realize how big he was to that team last season and sort of the energy that he brings to that group. So moving forward, could you envision, if the expansion list kind of sets up that way, that they might be willing to make a side deal in order to protect Matt Dumba?
I think that Billy has definitely talked that he would be willing to do that. No, I that gives a lot of Wild fans indigestion, because they all of a sudden remember back 4 years ago when the Wild did that to protect Dumba as well, Dumba and a couple other guys, and they basically made a deal, gave them Alex Tuck so they could take Eric Holla, and then both guys have monster years and they go to the Stanley Cup final. So that always makes Wild fans nervous. But I think with the amount of draft picks they have, the amount of mid-range prospects that they have, that's something that he would talk to Ron Francis about. I know that Billy Guerin doesn't want to lose Matt Dumba. I think he loves the top 4 of this blue line. But he might not have a choice. And if it looks like Ron Francis isn't entertaining some sort of side deal in that avenue, he might have to just trade him for futures in some other trade as well. It's not easy, though, to trade Matt Dumba. They tried all offseason. It didn't get done. He makes $7.4 million, I believe, in real money next year. So that's a big ticket for Matt. But he is coming off a very, a rebound year. And it's going to be just another interesting wrinkle here. And this organization's been pretty quiet for a team that is going to be very busy here in the next 2 weeks. And that's why I just think behind the scenes right now, Bill Guerin and his staff, he's brought in Ray Shiro, he has Randy Sexton here. I think they're workshopping a lot of different avenues, making a lot of different calls to try to figure out how to unwind this cobweb that they find themselves in here, because it just, you add the expansion problem to this, and it takes already what was a complicated offseason and makes it just that much more difficult.
Could Victor Rask be that odd guy out? You mentioned the draft picks. One of the things I had heard, Russo, was leveraging that extra first-round pick that the Wild have this year and try and package that with a Victor Rask to go to Seattle to make sure that they don't take a guy like Matt Dumba. Could that make sense to you?
See, it would for me. I don't know if it would for Ron Francis. Now, Ron Francis, he is the one that signed Victor Rask to this contract, and he's entering the last year at $4 million. So he might have an affinity for him, but I don't know if he would do that, in lieu of taking a really good player in Carson Soucy or Matt Dumba. That's, to me, what the interesting thing is. And with the actual entry draft coming after the expansion draft, that also might complicate matters, because if you're gonna, they have the 21st and 25th pick, really 22nd and 26th, just because of Arizona having the void pick. But I think that I almost said Carolina, but I think Seattle would love to know who's going to be there at those numbers to see if it would be worth taking a Rask and a first to make that sort of side deal. But I think that is the way that I would go with Billy. I just don't know if you can somehow sway Seattle with just a pick in the 20s to just take a Rask over having the ability to even take a Nico Sturm. I mean, Nico Sturm's somebody that I think is a really good player. Nico, in a lot of ways, I'm not saying he's William Karlsson, but if you follow that sort of template that Vegas had, if you look at a Nico Sturm, who's been playing fourth line center here, had a great rookie year, Seattle might look at him and say, you know what, could we elevate him in our lineup where Minnesota can't, and all of a sudden maybe untap some potential there for a guy like that. So, right now, if the Wild go the 7-3-1 route, and they don't ask Parise to waive his no move for the purposes of expansion, Nico is probably going to be unprotected. Soucy and Dumba would be unprotected. And now you have 3 really quality players, and as a first-round pick in the 20s going to be good enough to get you off that to take Victor Rask. To me, that's the question.
Now, maybe it's not realistic. What about their goaltender, Mike?
That's a great question too, because we're not talking about the goaltending, and I think they're going to protect Talbot. I think 2 months ago they were going to protect Kähkönen, and then Talbot just took off, and Kähkönen. The big common belief among scouts in this league is that Kähkönen is not a number 1; that he's going to be a number 2 throughout his career, and I think the Wild have that same belief. Even though Kähkönen had a heck of a year and was riding this team when Talbot was first injured. And then had the COVID issue and had to miss 14 days. And Kähkönen really impressed me, and obviously won a ton of games for this team. And at one point was in the Calder conversation until he really fell apart his last 8 or 9 starts. So, but I do think the Wild, because they have changed their mind and they're going to protect Talbot. And so now you have Kähkönen in the situation, and you don't know at 24 years old what Seattle thinks of him. And, that could be another option for them to take. We keep on talking Soucy, Dumba, and Nico Sturm. Well, Kähkönen's sitting there as well. And I think that would be the worst case scenario for the Wild if all of a sudden Kähkönen or Sturm were taken. Because the other thing that the Wild really need in expansion, if they're going to lose a player, they could use the cap flexibility. And that's the only, to me, the benefit if you lost to Dumba is at least you're getting $6 million back.
Yeah.
To have to spend this offseason and spend on guys like Kaprizov, Fiala, and fill out the rest of the roster. Even Carson Soucy's in the 275 range. If the Wild go into expansion and lose a $725,000 player, I think that's going to be really a problem for them. And then they're going to have to almost figure out how they're going to respond to that. But
that's
I do think that
Seattle has. We were just talking about this before you joined.
Yeah.
Looking at Tampa, saying like, look,
yes,
leave all these expensive guys exposed. They're like, look, we're taking a guy that makes $925. Convince us otherwise.
Yep, yeah. Exactly. We'll take. Yeah, you expect us to take Ryan McDonough. We're going to take Cal Foote. How about that? It's an interesting thing that Ron Francis finds himself on, and he's a very smart guy, and he keeps everything in house. And it really is a fascinating thing. But it's what to me is so fascinating, just from a tunnel vision standpoint, covering the Minnesota Wild, is that the Wild, this is 2 expansion drafts in a row where they have been, they've had their minds turned into a pretzel by this thing. And I remember when Billy Guerin first got to Minnesota, he's like, we're not going to follow down that suit of losing an Alex Tuck. We're just going to accept that we're going to lose one good player and all that stuff. And here he is, year and a half, 2 years later, and he's like, maybe I shouldn't have been talking, because he finds himself in that situation where he's trying to figure out many different ways to maneuver and manipulate this whole process. And then as we've all talked about, then he's got that added problems of Fiala and Kaprizov and filling out the rest of the roster, and the fact that this team still is extremely weak up the middle. And he's got a lot of work to do here, which could explain why he's been sort of on radio silence here the last week, because I don't think he wants a lot of this stuff out in the public airways.
Now, both you and Frank have mentioned the same number, and I need you guys. I look at Kevin Fiala. He, even if we prorate his numbers, it's 65 and 69 points the last 2 years. You look at points per game the last 2 seasons. He's not a top 50 player either one. Like, it's great that you want to ask for $8 million. I don't see remotely how that's realistic for the Wild. Like, and it's not like this guy's 2 years in, and he's been in the league for many years. Like, he's a good player. I like him, but am I missing something here? Does that seem really high?
No, it does seem high. And I will say a lot of this is conjecture. It's not like I'm getting this from either side. A lot of this is just, I will say, working the room, so to speak, and talking to a lot of sources that are, that have a lot better knowledge on me. And so I just think he's aiming high right now. And I think if he continues to aim high right there, I just don't see that Billy Guerin's going to do that. And he could find himself on another team. He was in a contract squabble a couple of years ago. Now, a lot of that contract dispute with the Wild was delayed because all of a sudden Paul Fenton was fired at the end of July, and they went 3 weeks without a general manager. And Tom Curvers, the acting GM at the time, was not about to sign Kevin Fiala to a long-term deal without knowing that he wasn't going to be the GM of the team. So then Bill came in August 20th and then picked it up. The first act that he really did was sign Spurgeon to the extension. But then he started to really work on Fiala, and I think he was blown away that how difficult it was to get Fiala signed. And he signed eventually the bridge deal on the eve of camp, and it kept him out of camp for a couple of weeks and really delayed the start of his season. He just got off to a real slow start, and he delayed his. I should mention it delayed the start of the season, not because of really the contract dispute, but because he signed so late. It was hard for him to get a work visa in time, and so he missed a couple of weeks, and it really slowed things down. And then he absolutely erupted starting in November, but really at the end of January, February, up until the pause of 2 seasons ago. And this year, same thing, slow start to the year, but then he really caught fire there midseason and late and scored a bunch of clutch goals. Not a great postseason, tons of chances. Had a huge game 6, but wasn't as productive as the Wild had expected here. So I just think, and you guys know this, there are certain guys that you probably want to keep hungry, that you want to keep on sort of short-term deals, not throw them 7 or 8 years, and then, they go into sort of retirement mode. Joel Eriksson Ek is one of those guys wired in a way that I think that Billy Guerin felt like the term and the security would not get him to change his approach, where I just think that certain players, they have a little concern on whether or not they're going to go and give 7 or 8 years. They've obviously offered that to Kaprizov. There's no way they offer it to Fiala unless the salary of that deal was extremely beneficial to them. So, I see the Wild offering him 3-4 years, maybe 5 max. I'd even be shocked on a 5-year deal. And I just think this is going to be a fight. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they've made headway this week. The good news is that they've started talking, the Wild and Craig Oster, his agent, and we'll see where this goes. Obviously, we all know that Newport's very reasonable, people there. Craig Oster's a sensational agent. And, my gut says they eventually get it done. But if this gets to a point where the Wild could use Fiala in a deal to go get a center, I could see them absolutely doing that.
Interesting.
Mike, for a lot of people who aren't Wild fans, they probably look and say, why would you give 8 years to a guy like Eriksson Ek? Because people don't watch him. You watch him every day. Is Eriksson Ek like Bergeron Barkov light a little bit? Is he underappreciated maybe for his overall game? Or I'm not saying he's suddenly going to be a multiple Selke trophy winner or anything, but what is it that they like so much about Eriksson Ek?
Well, I mean, he's such a pro. He's only 24 years old. And they feel that, especially in an organization, there are 2 things here, is that the Wild have proven for 20 years how difficult it is to acquire centers. So here they have a really good one that was 4th in Selke voting, had a breakout year with 19 goals in a shortened season, albeit against, playing 7 teams, 4 of them being the 3 California teams in Arizona. So I think that helps your production a little bit with the way that those teams were defensively this year. But he keeps himself in impeccable shape. And he's just this great character, a shutdown guy that just annoys a lot of people. But in this organization, with how light they are at center, he's going to continue to get big time minutes here. And he's going to start to get really significant power play time and more like second line winners, maybe potentially, scoring skilled wingers on his side. So I think the gamble that the Wild are taking is that if he continues to elevate his role in this team and continues his production, that not only is he going to be this great defensive center that they have, but he's actually going to be a quality 2-way center that can put up points every single year. And because of that, if all of a sudden he starts putting up points for a guy that's a UFA in 2024 as well, suddenly he could be a $6 or $7 million player. So they decided to take the gamble, take him to age 32, and feel like eventually that AAV is going to be really, really reasonable in a cap world that eventually is going to go up as well. So that was the gamble they took. I always thought he'd be in the 4.75 range, but I never thought that they'd go 8 years. And I think that was sort of the give and take that they did. But yeah, at first the term shocked me. But I know how much this team absolutely loves him. I also know how hard it is for this team to keep centers and have centers. And this is an organization that hasn't developed a ton of really quality centers, or when they draft a center, eventually he just miraculously becomes a winger. That's been a huge trend here in Minnesota. I mean, we're seeing that with Matt Boldy right now. I mean, Matt Boldy looks like he's going to be a really, really quality winger. And, we'll see Marco Rossi, if he could continue to be up the middle and develop in that situation when he comes to the team as well. But that was why they went 8 years there. And it's a gamble that they hope that will pay off. At least for the first time in Wild history, they gave that 8-year deal to a guy in his, lower half of his 20s rather than a 30-year-old.
Mike, last question for me. It's dependent on so much on what happens with all these questions that we've asked you over the last few minutes, but how good can this Wild team be?
I think it's good. I mean, that is the other challenge here from Billy Guerin is he's trying to also keep this team on the rise. And I think this team has the ability to be really good in the next couple of years. But I think Billy's challenge is that he really believes one reason why this team is great is that top four blue line, which is why he's trying to figure out everything in his humanly possible to keep Dumba in the fold here. But eventually, the reality is that Suter, Brodin, and Spurgeon all have no moves. And Dumba's UFA in 2 years. So I still think it would probably be smart of him to try to move Dumba and then suddenly, go out and stopgap that until maybe a Kalen Addison develops and things like that. But what I think excites Wild fans and excites Billy Guerin is for the first time in a long, long time, because the Wild in the previous regimes they were always in win now mode, and they always had traded draft picks and prospects and things like that. This team has a pipeline of really quality kids coming. And, last year, Judd Brackett had a great draft with Rossi, and hopefully he's completely healthy. I was texting with him the other day. He's feeling great. You're seeing videos of him on the ice, thankfully for his health situation primarily, but for his career as well. He looks like he is back on the mend and will be doing everything possible to make this team out of camp. You have Boldy here. You have Kuznetsov, Ryan O'Rourke. I was talking to our prospect writer, Corey Pronman, the other day. He absolutely loves the Damon Hunt pick in last year's draft and loved what he did in the WHL this year. So suddenly, Adam Beckman is in the fold as well. So you have all these kids coming, which is what I think also gives Billy Guerin flexibility that if he wants to eventually move a Fiala, Greenway, a Dumba, that he has that ability because he also added Addison as well. So, and as we saw this year, I mean, it's not always a given that just because Vegas and Colorado are loaded with talent that they're going to wind up in the Stanley Cup final every year. And so Minnesota, if they get to that point where they can compete with those teams, I think that they could continue, but I think they're going to continue to be a competitive team. And now it's just a matter of these kids can develop to really move this team over the top so this organization can finally, after 20 years, take that next step.
All right, Mike, we appreciate it. We always like to end in rapid fire. And the only rule, you have to answer every question.
Okay, right, great. So, I'm great at these rapid fires.
Yeah. So here we go. You had a unique situation because you covered hockey in Florida and in Minnesota, two vastly different states, two vastly different hockey markets. What was the major difference in covering hockey in Minnesota to Florida?
Oh, I don't want to offend the Florida fans, but just the rabidness. Like in Minnesota, you just feel like you know who you're writing for, where that just wasn't always the case in Florida. Now, maybe it's the social media world, but just the rabid nature of hockey fans here, they just absolutely love the sport, and it just excites me as a hockey writer to know that you're writing to people that just totally get it and love it.
What was the best or most underrated part about covering hockey in Florida?
Probably the weather. I mean, it was great. The other thing is Frank would appreciate is that when I covered the Florida Panthers, and I know I'm not being rapid, they were a dysfunctional franchise. And as a beat writer, that makes it fun sometimes.
That makes it awesome.
Yes.
Your cocktail of choice, alcoholic or non-alcoholic, after a long day of digging in on stories?
Red wine, usually a Cab Sauvignon or probably a Chianti Classico.
So if Russo's at the Professional Hockey Writers year-end party and the karaoke machine is there, what song are you singing?
Probably it's going to be a Trampled by Turtles song, which you guys might not be familiar with. They're a huge band here in Minnesota, and probably I would say Winners by Trampled by Turtles.
Ooh. Of the current reporters, who's the number one guaranteed fun night on the town?
I'd say Pierre LeBrun. Every time I'm out with him, I just have a blast. He just holds court, drink great wine. It's always a blast. One of my favorite nights out, and I've had a ton with him, was at Burn Steakhouse during the All-Star game in Tampa. And he bought, Frank, were you there for that?
I wasn't, but I've heard the story.
Yeah. He bought there was some vintage from, I think it was I don't know if it was a Bordeaux. He bought a 1967 and a 1977 of the same exact wine, and we all taste tested it. And I'm telling you that 1967 tasted like you were drinking dirt. Like you tasted the oldness in that wine, and the 77 was unbelievable. And I still tell that story because I just love to know, like we were drinking a bottle of wine that was in that bottle for 50 some odd years and in a barrel before then. I just thought that was unbelievable that we were, and of course, as you know, Pierre, he was kind enough to actually pay for the meal, the drinks, I should say.
Okay. So Kaprizov, what term, what AAV?
I'd say 5 years at 7.5.
And who do you think your best guess today the Wild are going to lose in expansion?
I honestly, genuinely believe it's going to be Carson Soucy, but we will see.
Mike? Oh yeah, I guess one last one. You joked about it earlier because the Wild, I think you look at teams in 2017, Florida, Columbus, and Minnesota were like the poster boys of how they maybe outthought themselves at expansion. And do you think, have they learned from it, or could history repeat itself?
You know, I think they've learned from it, but I do think Billy is willing to give up assets. I just don't think that he's not giving up a Rossi or a Boldy or something like that in a deal like this. But would he give up a first? They have 5 picks in their top 3. Would he give up a Beckman? I think he might consider it. I think he should be just careful and just lose the player that they're going to take. That'd be personally what I do, but I could see where right now he finds himself in a lot of complicated decisions here.
Well, Mike, thanks for joining us, man. Minnesota is definitely one of the teams to watch heading in for so many reasons: contracts, potential buyouts, trades, expansion draft. It's going to be a fun few weeks.
Yep, definitely. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Frank. It was a pleasure being on here.
Thanks, Russo.
It's going to be an interesting time in Minnesota. And Frank, we didn't talk to Mike. I'm kicking myself now. I literally just thought about it. But, we talked about a guy like Parise waiving his no movement clause, even just to, allow some more protection. Well, their back end's where they have trouble. Would Ryan Suter waive it? Because I don't see Seattle claiming him, and then they could protect Dumba.
I think that almost makes more sense than Parise. They have identical contracts. And so for all the reasons that we mentioned, getting that $5 million in savings next year. But in addition to having another defensive spot, if you go 7-3-1, that you could then protect your guys, Suter to me makes more sense. Obviously, there's been a pretty significant decline in terms of his play. He's got all the same question marks, although just not as rapidly as Parise did with the healthy scratches. He's still a serviceable player, just not commensurate to his cap hit. And that's only going to get worse as time goes on. Honestly, I really wonder if he makes more sense than Parise. Just there hasn't seemed to be any rumblings about that just yet.
As a buyout?
Yeah, I do think Ryan Suter makes more sense. Yeah.
Oh, well, geez, this offseason is going to be crazy. We didn't even touch on the Jack Eichel, where he's going to go. Lots going on. So I look forward to Monday to catch up, because really over the weekend, lots can change in the NHL as buyouts open up and, potential trades and everything else. This next 3 weeks, I believe, is going to be one of the most exciting 3 weeks we've seen in NHL offseason in a long, long time.
Yep, totally agree. Let's do it.
Thanks for listening to the DFO Rundown with Saravalli and Gregor. Keep it locked on dailyfaceoff.com and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from to never miss an episode.